House of Dark Shadows, where death is a way of life, and where there is always terror at Collinwood. There's nowhere to run, there's no place to hide. This podcast is fun, but there are spoilers inside. Welcome to Terror at Collinwood. I am your hostess, Danielle, aka Penny Dreadful, and I am thrilled to get to today's show because you're going to be hearing from the illustrious Ricardo Delgado as we're going to be talking about House of Dark Shadows, Sombras Tenebrosas, and many other things, including the art of Dracula of Transylvania, so stay tuned for that. But there are a couple of orders of business here that I'd like to attend to first before we get to that. First, congratulations to the one and only Catherine Lee Scott on receiving the Life Career Award at the 50th Annual Saturn Awards. The Saturn Awards organization is the official awards group of the Academy of Science Fiction, Fantasy, and Horror Films, so a very prestigious award to be certain. So many congratulations to Catherine on that well-deserved award. Also, I'd like to issue a correction about something I said in episode 40. For that episode, I pulled some information from an online article, and I should have double-checked that because it wasn't entirely accurate. It was almost accurate, but not quite there. It stated, and I repeated on the podcast, that a theremin was used in the Dark Shadows theme. That's actually incorrect. However, as my charming and brilliant guest, Ben Alba, pointed out, Colbert was going for a theremin sound. So it makes sense that one would think that it was a theremin, and I don't think Colbert was overly vocal about disabusing people of that notion, because that's kind of what he was going for. Anyway, according to the interview with Robert Colbert in the booklet included with discs 5 and 6 of the complete Dark Shadows soundtrack music collection, and this is a quote, "Many people assume that the instrument playing the Dark Shadows theme was a theremin, but it wasn't. The opening theme was neither a theremin nor an onde martineau. It was a Yamaha synthesizer with a string on it that made a theremin-like sound. We couldn't find an onde martineau player or a theremin player in New York, so we used that. And it was played by a very famous pianist named Dick Hyman. What you're hearing in the theme is, melodically, a Yamaha on top, an alto flute on the bottom, then a bass, vibes, and harp playing atonal accompaniment. 5 players in all." That was a quote from Colbert. This is me now. I actually knew that Colbert had an altered synthesizer that he used to play the Dark Shadows theme, but I misremembered this. In my memory, I remembered it as Colbert using the synthesizer to play the theme for Dan Curtis the first time he presented it to him, but that's completely incorrect. He actually whistled the theme for Dan Curtis. He came in and was shaking his head around and whistling it, and that's on an interview on one of the DVDs, and you can find it on YouTube as well, an interview with Robert Colbert. So he actually whistled the theme to Dan Curtis to present it to him. In my memory, I remembered it as this altered synthesizer because I had read this interview before, and it just, I am over 700 years old, darlings. I do forget things. But anyway, thank you to Bishop John 65 on YouTube for calling this to my attention. Also, from the same interview, just a side note, Colbert also adds that almost all of the Dark Shadows music cues were recorded in England. It was money, pure and simple. The theme itself, however, was recorded in New York. So there you go. And lastly, another kind of, trivia bit here. In this episode, I kind of avoided mentioning the official release date for House of Dark Shadows, which is listed as October 28th, 1970. However, there were several screenings prior to that, going back to August of 1970. Per the Collinsport Historical Society, film archivist and Dark Shadows fan Darren Gross found an even earlier showing of House of Dark Shadows. He sent me a scan of a newspaper ad for a preview of the film that took place August 24th, 1970 at the DeMille Theater in Manhattan. He says the October 28th date often referenced is when House of Dark Shadows opened in New York City and Los Angeles. So, and there were several other screenings prior to that October date in August and September for House of Dark Shadows. So the official date is listed as October 28th on most sources, but that's I guess those were the big openings in New York and Los Angeles, but with several screenings prior to that date. And in the show notes, I'll put a link to the Collinsport Historical Society article so you can read that. Anyway, that wraps that up. So let's get on with the show. House of Dark Shadows. Nobody lives there. Welcome to Terror at Collinwood. 'Tis I, Danielle, the despicable doppelganger of Penny Dreadful, and today I am thrilled and honored to be joined by my guest, Ricardo Delgado, who is one of Hollywood's leading conceptual designers, a film and comic book artist who has worked on films including The Incredibles, Men in Black, and Apollo 13. He is the author and creator of the comic book series Age of Reptiles, which won an Eisner Award for talent deserving of wide recognition in 1997. Ricardo was an illustrator in Herman F. Zimmerman's design team on the pilot and first season of Star Trek Deep Space Nine, contributing toward the design of the exteriors and interiors of the station itself, and storyboarding the series' opening titles under Dan Curry's direction. Recently, he wrote and illustrated the lavish Dracula of Transylvania, a fresh, bold retelling of the classic Stoker dark fairy tale with the pulse-pounding pace of the modern thriller. And coming soon from Clover Press is The Art of Dracula of Transylvania, which is really exciting. I was just looking at an interview with Ricardo about that yesterday, and we're going to talk about that. So welcome to the show, Ricardo.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and certainly I'm here not just as as the person being interviewed, but as someone who enjoys all things Dark Shadows related, Halloween related, vampire related. So I'm happy to be here.
Wonderful. Well, I heard you recently on Derek M. Cook's wonderful Monster Kid Radio, and I appreciate you guys mentioning Terror at Collinwood. But of course, we had also been talking for quite a bit before that, and you were kind enough a few months back to send me this amazing book, Dracula of Transylvania. And I was just telling Ricardo before we started the show today that I was at a convention this past weekend doing an appearance as Penny, and I walked in the vendor room, and there it was, this book sitting on a table prominently displayed. And I said, "Hey, I have that. I'm going to interview Ricardo next week on my podcast." And the gentleman at the table was just raving about the book and raving about you. But it is a very striking book, a reimagining of the classic Stoker tale, infusing it with lots of different classic vampire references and lore and things like that, and beautifully illustrated as well. So, Ricardo, tell us a little bit about Dracula of Transylvania and The Art of Dracula of Transylvania coming up soon.
Well, Dracula of Transylvania is essentially a dream project come true, and it's essentially my take on the Stoker story, the classic Stoker work of literature. You know, as I was telling Derek during his interview with me a few weeks back, that you know, in terms of the universal monsters, you know, the Frankenstein monster was kind of you know, victim of circumstance, or circumstances, as we should say. He was kind of, you know, put together, and Larry Talbot, you know, is probably the most sympathetic, you know, character. The Wolfman is just kind of, well, you know, hey, I got bitten by this dog that called Bella, and so suddenly I'm cursed. But Dracula was the one universal monster that said, "Hey, I actually want to be the bad guy. I actually don't mind breaking into your house at night and drinking your blood, and, you know, causing havoc." And so for me, it was kind of a dream project to be able to sort of take all of the Draculas I loved as a kid, you know, and because I loved Bela Lugosi, Christopher Lee, you know, John Carradine, and just kind of assemble them into a version of the character that I grew up loving, and creating this sort of very malevolent, no prisoners taken Dracula, kind of based as well on Tomb of Dracula, the Marvel
Oh,
comic book that
yes. Yeah.
I adored that
Mm-hmm.
comic book as a kid, because that was like the no fooling around Dracula.
Yeah.
And I also wanted to create a supernatural world around the Count, and expand that world. And, you know, throughout some of the stories that I loved as a kid, he was referred to as the king of the vampires. And so in this one, in this story, very much so, there's a bunch of subjects and rebels around him in vampiric society. And so I just kind of I rewrote the story. I paced it a lot more quickly. And it was truly a privilege. I feel like my stuff just kind of feels, it kind of reads more like, my pitch was The Exorcist meets Lord of the Rings, right?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, and as a designer, I was able to sort of take my design acumen and create concept art based on the characters and locations, in the story, and publish them through Clover Press in the book that you hold right now. Now, the thing that's kind of interesting is that I generated over 100 pieces of art for the novel, but Clover could only fit about 20 images in there. And so the book did very well. And, I'm very thankful and blessed to have had that happen. And Clover came back and said, hey, this project has, as we say in the publishing business, legs. So why don't we do an art of Dracula and cram all of your artwork into one book? And I said, that's terrific. I said, well, the thing that I have to kind of sort of add to that is the idea that when I was growing up, I had kind of two stages of my fandom. It's like pre-1977 and then 1977 forward. My adoration of the Universal monsters as a little boy, and and then in 1977 Star Wars came out, and I was really sort of taken by that as well. And so if I could combine those and take the artwork that I generated that was not published, and then annotate it and sort of write about my experiences as a little kid with the Don Post, monster masks from Famous Monsters of Filmland, and how much I love Famous Monsters of Filmland, and what each of those pieces meant to me, and then add those annotations to the images so they don't just sit there alone. Because otherwise, it's cool to look at artwork, but to sort of read about the roots of the artwork is what I loved about those Art of Star Wars books as a little kid. So I kind of combined those, and here we are. This thing is about to be published. There's a Kickstarter campaign that's imminent as we're being recorded, and I'm really excited about it.
Wonderful. This episode is probably going to be going up probably in the first couple of weeks of November. Will the Kickstarter be live by then?
I think it'll be live at that point. Absolutely.
Okay.
So
okay. I'll post a link in the show notes.
You're very kind. Thank you. You guys can all track me down on Facebook and Instagram. And I'll have stuff there as well, but most certainly a privilege to have my stuff posted on your stuff, Penny, as well.
Oh my goodness, it's certainly an honor. Now, you mentioned before we started recording, just real quick here, you mentioned also writing another vampire story set in Costa Rica, I believe.
Yes, it's a folk tale. It's a very personal story set on in my parents' hometown in Costa Rica in 1948, during a time of revolution. And in talking with my parents, about their experiences during that time, during their childhood, during the revolution, it was just kind of a transition from, an idyllic childhood to starting to be sort of aware of, the political differences that, adults could have. And so I thought it was just natural for a story to be told like that, but I'm adding a vampire to that story. So,
oh, great.
Yes,
great.
no, it's a lot of fun, but it's also great to hear my parents talk about their childhood, stuff that, they think is not important, but turns out that it actually is really important and interesting and fascinating. Everyone in America has a hometown that is not their hometown. It's the hometown of their ancestors, and
Sure.
that's a very unique kind of American thing that can be expressed over and over and over again. And I'm pretty much done with it. That I need to sort of sit down and design it. But it's really cool to look through old photos of my parents' hometown, and yeah, it's all about
Sure.
chasing your passions in life.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
You're driven by creativity, which is what I admire. That in those inspirations and taking hold of them and following through on them. I look forward to seeing when this comes out because it sounds really, really cool.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I get it too. My as I mentioned before we started recording, my family's they're all from Portugal. They came out first generation here in America. So I grew up with kind of a foot in both worlds, in American culture and Portuguese culture. So
Right.
and those legends and folk tales and
Stories.
things, the stories that just passed down from my grandparents and my aunts and uncles that would tell me all about all these things. Just always stayed in my head. And one of
Right. So
these,
my mom would tell me folk tales about
yeah,
La Carreta Sin Bueyes, which is basically the cart without cows, right? Or the La Llorona, right?
oh yeah,
And so those fables like that are kind of woven into the culture of Latin America.
yeah,
And so I'm sort of taking advantage of it. And the vampire in my story is sort of La Llorona, or La Segua, or La Careta Sin Bueyes. It's just kind of a manifestation of change as well,
sure,
because the country and of Costa Rica and the town of Alajuela were really never the same after the events of that revolution. And so to sort of add a layer of the supernatural on top of that was really fun and fulfilling. And my parents got a kick out of it too, as well too. So
wonderful.
yes.
Now speaking about supernatural and vampires, we're going to be talking about House of Dark Shadows, but I want to start out a little bit with your childhood and how you discovered Sombras Tenebrosas.
Well, sure. It's a pretty funny story. I'm actually very proud of it. In 1972, my mom and dad decided that my youngest brother would be born in Costa Rica. We were all, myself and the rest of my siblings we were born here in the States, but my parents decided, hey, the last kid should be born in Costa Rica. So my dad packed my mom and the rest of us up and shipped us down to Costa Rica, and somewhere between second and third grade, I think the summer between second and third grade. So I was still very young. And we got to Costa Rica, and we just inundated in this very, different place of the world where everything smelled beautifully and exotically, and but in the middle of that, one of my uncles kind of realized that I was a fan of those Universal monster movies, and he's like, hey, you should watch this show. It's called Sombras Tenebrosas, which of course is a translation to Dark Shadows. And so we started watching these black and white TV show, this black and white TV show that I instantly for me felt very analogous to the Universal monster films, because they were in black and white, right? And I think we spent about 5 or 6 months down in Costa Rica, and watch Dark Shadows every day, and it was dubbed in Spanish. And so all the only impression I had of Dark Shadows, even into my adulthood, was that everyone that was a vampire, or everyone that was in the cast of Dark Shadows, spoke Spanish. and so it was quite strange to me to sort of think about. And that's one of the big reasons that my vampires in Dracula of Transylvania speak other languages, because I grew up hearing Barnabas Collins speak in Spanish. The whole cast spoke in Spanish. It was pretty cool, and I was just really struck by the moodiness of the show. There was sort of this, inherent claustrophobia that was in the Universal films as well. And my uncle, his name is Felix, took me to see Brides of Dracula and El Santo contra las Mujeres Vampiro as well, which is another classic. And so that was kind of really where my focus on vampires really, really began to sort of to grow, this sort of being taken back to your parents' home country and sort of immersing yourself in the culture that you came from. And on top of that, you have all these folk tales that are being told to you. And you have, you're this little kid and you're buying Famous Monsters of Filmland, and you're seeing all these black and white photos that before you put in, I remember once, we were back home, and I was looking at an issue of Famous Monsters, and I think it was Christopher Lee. He had been staked.
Yeah.
And it was very furry and very gory, and my mom just walked by and just whisked that away from me. Said, no, that's not appropriate for little kids. And back then, Famous Monsters cost like $1.50. That was a lot of dough back then for me. We had a dollar allowance every week, and so you had to be really, don't buy Werewolf by Night, Tomb of Dracula, or Famous Monsters.
Right. Well, that's a tough call.
I saved my pennies, absolutely. And so what I would do is I would, if I couldn't afford one or the other, I would take one and put it behind the gold key, for example.
To hide,
right? And so, okay, they'll never look here, and I would check the magazine rack the next week. Sometimes it'd be there, sometimes it wouldn't, but those are great days.
Those 70s Marvel monsters I love them so much, and it's great that they're bringing them into the Marvel Cinematic Universe now. They did the Werewolf by Night TV special, which was really cool.
And it was cool to see all that, and yet as a fan of those classic Universal monster movies, I wonder what those Universal execs are thinking. Like, if only we had something like that we could put out that would, fans could relate to. In terms of horror, what characters do we have in our milieu
exactly
that could work, that in that, black and white horror, classic horror.
Right. But the problem is Universal will then go, but let's put Tom Cruise in it and make it into an action movie. And that people will really like. It's like, it's not there's a reason that stuff is iconic and that people love it, and it's archetypal. It's like, you don't have to alter it drastically. You might tweak a few things here and there, but it's the recipe for success or something that people are going to love and tap into is already there, as is seen by that. People are speaking in a very positive way about Werewolf by Night. It's really funny too. I want to talk about this. Like, we're talking about, dark shadows, and one of the things I like doing with this podcast is sort of reinforcing this idea that I think in recent years people have kind of gotten away from in discourse about dark shadows, is that it is its own thing. It's a very unique thing, but it's also a huge thing for monster kids growing up in the 60s and 70s. It's part of that tapestry, and it's an important and key part of that in terms of pop culture and its influence. And Dan Curtis himself, although I think he kind of downplayed it a little bit in interviews, probably because at the time it was probably not really looked fondly upon to be a horror fan or a monster kid. They didn't call it Monster Kid back then, but Curtis he always said, I love that stuff. The Frankensteins, the Draculas, the ghost stories, Turn of the Screw. He could see it in his eye. He lights up in his interviews, and I love that stuff. He infused all of that into Dark Shadows. So I think he should get a Rondo Award for the Monster Kid Hall of Fame, honestly, because Dan Curtis should be honored in that way.
If that hasn't happened already, that's a crime against humanity, because I think that Dan Curtis was, in my opinion, one of the seminal figures in the development of the monster culture that as it exists now. Like if you look at, Dark Shadows to the Night Stalker, Dark Shadows to House of Dark Shadows, to the Night Stalker, and then what was called Bram Stoker's Dracula when it originally came out with Jack Palance. That's a tremendous run of monster movie making, ingenious, in my opinion, use of location and cinematography. Those four sort of stories, if you will. I have not seen the Dan Curtis Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I need to track
that's
that one down.
Really good. I think it was nominated for Emmys. I mean, it was Jack Palance was a great Mr. Hyde, because Jack Palance he was very intimidating. In fact, when they made the 89 Batman, they were trying to find somebody who could be more intimidating than Jack Nicholson to play his boss, and to play Boss Grissom, and it was Jack Palance. He relished in playing Hyde. It was very evil, that pure id, that Hyde is, and he was a great Jekyll and Hyde.
He was a great Dracula as well. There's a scene where he's telling Harker to write the letters and tell him you're not going to be back soon, and he just grabs Harker by the neck. He's such a big dude, he just kind of really fit the part. Again, I have to take a step back and just kind of say again that, in terms of creating stories like this, Dan Curtis just really, is one of the seminal figures. For me, right up there with Val Lewton and Carl Laemmle and all those guys. The fabric of what we love is based on his enthusiasm. And I have the Night Stalker, Night Strangler 2-disc DVD, and they interview Curtis there, and his enthusiasm is just off the charts. You could just really, really tell the way he talks about meeting Richard Matheson. It's just really amazing. But
and you can see it in the interviews on the Dark Shadows DVDs as well, and other people they speak to, like Sam Hall and Lara Parker and some of the other people involved with Dark Shadows reference. Somehow Dan, like, I don't know how Dan knew this stuff, but he knew it because he liked that stuff growing up. And Dark Shadows, he infused that into Dark Shadows. Dan, it's not only Dan Curtis, obviously the writers, the actors, the Robert Colbert, etc. But Curtis, I think, was responsible for putting that sort of classic horror, gothic horror spirit into the show. And Dark Shadows also bridged. And we have the famous 60s monster craze, but as you pointed out with things like the Marvel monsters, there was also a 70s monster craze, which I call the aftershock, because it's like after the shock theater package. You have the 70s monster craze, and Dark Shadows bridged the gap there. Dark Shadows went from the 60s into the early 70s, right? So
correct.
I think Dark Shadows is kind of the bridge there between 60s monster craze and 70s monster craze. 70s monster craze is becomes kind of a little more, I guess, Dr. Durant's Sanctum, which is a YouTube channel, he referred to it as a little more lurid, I guess, than the 60s monster craze.
I would agree with that.
Yeah. But it's great too. I was growing up during that time too, so I just that resonates with me. A lot of that imagery from that time period too. We have you watched Sombras Tenebrosas, then you came back to the States. Did you see it? Then you saw it in English here?
I did not see it in English. I could not find it. That was back when, for all the kids that are listening, we only had 5 or 6 TV channels on our televisions. And even into the 80s, I really couldn't find it. And so for many years, I knew it existed, but I was not able to see it in English. And it wasn't until I bought a DVD that had The Haunting of Collinwood and a few other sort of a bunch of episodes kind of put together that I started watching. And first of all, it shocked me to see episodes in color, number one. I was quite taken by that. But after, and I really enjoyed them as well.
Mhm.
Again, it was when the stuff I saw in Costa Rica in the early 70s was black and white, and it was very analogous to the Santo films and
Yeah.
also the Universal monster films. But to see it in color was just kind of another joy and another revelation, because um, you could really see from a standpoint of saturation of color, the fashion, the storytelling was just top notch. And it, now that I'm a jaded, film industry designer, I see how it must have been really hard to continuously make episodes every day.
Yeah.
And on top of that, there's an element of physical special effects that you have to add to a lot of the episodes
Mhm.
as well. And I don't know what the layout was for the stages where they shot Dark Shadows, but I wonder if they had all the sets around the outside and then just had the cameras positioned on the inside so you could go from set to set
Yeah.
really easily.
I hear, from what I understand, it was a very kind of a narrow set, almost like a rectangular kind of shape, and they sometimes they had to run, to get from one end of the set, the studio, to
Oh
the
my
other
goodness.
to do a scene. And sometimes there are some scenes every so often you'll see there's like a little lag, or somebody will come in seeming like they're a little, because they
Just a beat late.
yeah,
Interesting.
yeah, because sometimes the sets were. I mean, they had the standing sets that were always like Collinwood, I think, and the old
Right.
house. But then you had like some that would show up periodically, like Chris Jennings' cottage or something like that, that would show up periodically. But yeah, now when just before we move on to House of Dark Shadows, I
Sure.
want to mention, this you're talking about watching Dark Shadows in Costa Rica dubbed in Spanish, and a lot of fans aren't aware of the fact that Dark Shadows was huge in a lot of those Spanish-speaking countries.
Oh,
Jonathan Frid did a
the
tour.
family just like stopped what they were doing to
Yeah.
watch
Hmm.
Sombras Tenebrosas. Like,
Yeah.
it's 2 o'clock. We gotta. It's
Yeah.
kind of funny because I could sort of say this now as an adult. We would have lunch, pray the rosary, then watch Sombras Tenebrosas,
You have to
which is
protect yourself from the
yeah, no, and
supernatural
it's
forces
oh
coming
yeah,
through the
and
TV.
I remember just kind of sitting through the rosary thinking, okay, well, this will be over soon and we can watch Dark Shadows, or Sombras Tenebrosas. So
That's great. I love that story. That's
yeah,
fantastic.
no,
Uh,
it's a lot of fun. My mom could see, how, I don't want to say impatient. I'll say itchy I was to sort of
yeah.
get the rosary over, and then okay, we'll watch Sombras Tenebrosas. But it was quite a time. It was
That's
quite a
great.
time. Yeah.
There's a you mentioned the Santo films. There's a comic book that came out. I think it was probably must have been during that time period. It was a Blue Demon comic, a luchador
Oh,
comic, but
really?
it has Barnabas on the cover of the comic, and
No
it's like
kidding.
Blue Demon contra los vampiros or something. And I was like, I want to find it. I've seen the cover of it. I'll send you an image from it, of the cover. I've been trying to track that down because I wonder if the story inside has Barnabas in it, or if they were just using Barnabas to sort of draw interest, because it was Dark Shadows was such a big hit there. I wonder if they were trying to attract people's eyes to the cover or something like that.
Interesting. I don't
Yeah.
know, but I will say that I found two old Don Post Monster mask ads from Famous Monsters, and I posted one on Instagram and I posted the other one on Facebook. And the one that I posted on Instagram is kind of the classic. They had the license to do all of the Universal monsters. Dracula looks like Bela Lugosi. The
Yeah.
Frankenstein monster looks like Mr. Karloff.
Yeah.
But then the one I posted on Facebook, which I kind of like a little bit more, honestly, it's the there's one that says old vampire, and that's
Oh,
clearly the old That's
Oh yeah,
clearly old Barnabas makeup.
for
Clearly.
sure. From the House of Dark Shadows makeup
Yes.
that Dick Smith, yeah, oh, 100%. Yeah. They just
Yes.
they just didn't have the license for Dark Shadows, so they couldn't use that name, but it's obviously that's exactly what
Obviously
that is.
what it
Yeah.
is. There's a makeup guy that I know named Bart Mixon, who's a very nice man. He's on Instagram as well. And he explains that there's an interesting history with the Barnabas makeup, the
Mhm.
old age makeup, that part of it is from the Dustin Hoffman Little Big Man
Yes. Yep. Mhm.
film, and I was quite surprised to hear that.
Yeah, it
So
came out the same year, the Little Big Man. So yeah, Dick Smith was doing some repurposing there. I don't know if it was like a cost saving measure or if it just worked out that way, but yeah, yeah,
you
it's
know, as far as I'm concerned, Dick Smith can do whatever he wants. I
oh
mean,
for
he's
sure.
he's you know,
He
he's
did
one of the
the
legends in our business. My goodness. Uh,
100%. You agree? Yeah, he did the old age makeup for Barnabas on the TV show too. When Barnabas aged in the TV show, they brought in Dick Smith to do that as well. But
wow,
then
what a pedigree!
yeah,
What a
but then for
pedigree!
the movie version, it's way more terrifying. I mean, it's
They
scary.
went
The
like
one in the
this.
yeah,
They took everything in the TV show and then they amped it up for the picture.
yes,
Yes.
which is a great lead-in for our discussion on House of Dark Shadows. Amping it up to 11 for sure is the the motto should be the motto of House of Dark Shadows,
It's like when
which
Marty turns up the amp in Back to the Future. Yeah, that's what they
yeah,
did in House of Dark Shadows.
yeah,
And as much as I really enjoy and continue to enjoy the episodes, which are on Tubi, everyone. I'm
yeah.
probably the last one to explain all this, but
They are on Tubi, yeah. And for
um,
Halloween, they're on. I hear there was some on Peacock too. They have a
oh,
chunk of episodes. Yeah, I believe so. Yeah,
pretty cool. But
yeah.
anyway, I found out about House of Dark Shadows when I was in the early stages of writing Dracula of Transylvania. I was having lunch with two friends of mine, another artist named Pete Von Shawley and the legendary Don Glut.
Yes,
So
Don was
yes,
on
so
this show recently.
yeah, Don is amazing, and I've known him for many, many years, and we, share a lot of the same interests, uh, and but I'm just a kid compared to Don, and Don like knew Glenn Strange, he knew Forey Ackerman, like
Wow.
he knew those guys. He,
Yeah.
met many of the cast from Dark Shadows, and so I was telling him about the Dark Shadows DVD and Sombras Tenebrosas, right? And he said,
Mhm.
"Oh, well, you got to get House of Dark Shadows." And I said,
Mhm.
"Really?" And he said, "Yes, it's the movie." And Don would probably say he doesn't remember saying this, but he said it's like the cliff notes
Yes.
of Dark Shadows. It's
Yeah.
like you can just watch that and you're caught up with like the first part of the run of the show. And I went, okay. And so I didn't know that it was available on DVD, and I bought it right away. And holy smokes, what a treasure I think that picture is. And
Yeah.
I understand that some people like it and some people don't,
Yeah.
but
Yep.
I do feel like it is kind of a to paraphrase the great Don Glut, it is a great way for those that are late to the party to walk in and catch up. And I think that
Mhm.
there's a lot of wonderful things about that that picture that we can get into very, very specifically as we
Absolutely.
go
Yeah.
along.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And right. I mean, just right away, prior to even the film being released, if you've ever watched the trailers for House of Dark Shadows, I mean, the trailers are great, but they're also very, you would never see this today. The trailers spoil so many things in the movie, like Roger and Carolyn and Professor Stokes being turned into vampires, and then Carolyn being staked by Stokes and things that they show right in the trailer, and they would never do that today because it's
They
just
would never do that today. Yeah.
it's major things that happen in the film that are spoiled right in the trailer. And I love there are two things they say that are taglines for House of Dark Shadows. The famous one is "Come see how the vampires do it," which is just kind of a tacky tagline. I always thought my favorite is after they say that in the trailer, the voiceover goes, House, in a very Karloffian voice, goes, House of Dark Shadows. Nobody lives there. I love that. That one gets me every time. I love it. But I mean, right away you see that this is Dark Shadows with kind of a much, it's darker shadows. It's much more horror. The TV show, I've talked about horror and terror on this podcast before. The TV show leans much more into terror, and with definitely there's horror in it too. But I'd say maybe
there is
75% terror, 25% horror, maybe 70-30, something like that. But the House of Dark Shadows definitely pushes kind of things more into the horror direction. There's lots of terror. It's a beautiful gothic horror film set in the present day. But it also has a very Hammer-esque kind of quality to it.
Very much so. I mean, that was one of my overall thoughts, sort of watching the picture. I mean, I just saw it again recently to prepare for this interview, and it's just, it is sort of Dan Curtis's version of Hammer horror. Absolutely.
For sure. Yeah. It's for those who may not even have watched the TV show Dark Shadows. It's a great vampire movie. It's a great story and a great premise, and it did very well for MGM when it was released. Dan Curtis was trying to get a Dark Shadows movie made. So he started in 1968. He started kind of pitching this idea of doing a Dark Shadows movie as the show became a hit. And then when it became a huge hit in 1960, that's where it hit the peak during that 1897 storyline. Then MGM gave him the thumbs up. Sam Hall started writing the script during the Leviathan storyline. Sam Hall and Gordon Russell, they were working on that, and then they shot the film while the show was still going on. This is insane. I don't even know how they managed to do this, but the TV show was still going on concurrently with the filming of House of Dark Shadows. So it was this during the parallel time 1970 storyline. Barnabas got chained in his coffin so that the author William H. Loomis in parallel time could interview him about his life story, which certainly must be where Anne Rice got the idea for her interview with the van. She was a Dark
I'm not going to
fan.
disagree with that. I'm not going to disagree with that. Yeah.
I mean, she's on record as being a fan of the show. I'm pretty sure that's where she got the idea for that. So their film, all the kind of the leads of the show, well, a chunk of them went to go do House of Dark Shadows. David Selby and Lara Parker sort of, and Chris Penna kind of carried the load for the TV show. And they went up to Tarrytown to shoot this film. There was a new Collinwood, which was the Lyndhurst estate. And
an astonishing location.
Oh, yeah.
Amazing location.
Absolutely. It definitely has a very, it looks like a castle. I mean, it looks like a Gothic castle is exactly what it looks like. The Seaview Terrace, I love, looks like a haunted mansion, but this looks like a haunted castle. And originally Curtis wanted to edit together clips from the TV show as a theatrical film, which
I'd read that. Wow, that's pretty interesting. I can't
imagine how that would have worked. They abandoned that idea pretty early on, but I don't even know how they would have done that as a theatrical release. I could see that maybe as a TV movie or something like that, but I can't imagine they would have done that theatrically. So
I will say, if I could have a conversation with Mr. Curtis, the question that I would ask him is why retell the story, and why not tell another Dark Shadow story? Not that I'm complaining, but it is an interesting question in my opinion.
Yeah.
And the second observation I will make is that my first big job was on Star Trek Deep Space Nine, and that was being produced analogous to Star Trek The Next Generation. And being in the middle of that, I can say that it was incredibly chaotic. And the two stages were right across from each other. The production offices were on the other side of the Paramount lot. But it was nuts trying to create two TV shows. And then they intertwined them for the pilot, right? Briefly. Yeah. It was amazing. So, and that's being on the same lot. I don't know how they managed to shoot stuff on location while the show was being produced on a daily basis. That must have been nuts.
Yeah, it's just crazy. I mean, just the thought of that is just banana. And some of the actors were kind of doing double duty too.
Holy
on that.
smokes.
So, they're going back and forth and stuff. So great when the film opens, I mean, that they redo the theme from the TV show, but it's somehow scarier, and it ends with this bird like crying out, and it's you get just right away, you get into it. And as Dawn said, kind of the Cliff Notes version of the Barnabas
Yes.
storyline, but also it's I see it as a sort of a parallel universe version of the if the ghost of Sarah Collins had never appeared, because she sort of starts to bring out more of Barnabas's conscience in the TV show, the ghost of his dead little sister, right? So, but there's no Sarah in this. So this is how Dan Curtis originally envisioned Barnabas Collins, which was much more as a predator and a marauder, which he also was in the show, but he's tempered by these, the shades of gray that were infused into the character. And here there's some of that when he starts to have this hope of a cure, quote unquote cure, but it's more of a much darker version of the character.
Well, he also starts to feel like he could rediscover love as well throughout the story, right? But in the beginning, he's certainly this marauder, predator, as you described. He needs to feed right away. It's pretty cool. When Daphne is walking to her car, you can hear a bat on the soundtrack, and that kind of represents, in my opinion, Barnabas flying over past her and then landing next to the car and transforming. And so that attack happens really, really quickly. But I have to sort of just give pause overall and say that the photography in this picture is really amazing. The shadows are rich and dark. They are not afraid to put sort of darkened, clothed people in an all black, shadow-filled room, and it feels very ghostly at times. It's really impressive, and I think that they took great advantage in shooting day for night, but still making it feel mysterious and foreboding and really, really interesting.
Absolutely. I think Arthur Ornitz was the cinematographer on the film, I believe. It's beautifully shot. And the day for night, I noticed, like when I would watch it on TV, when they would show it around Halloween on whatever Superstation TVS or whatever, or you'd see it. I have the VHSs too. I think when they transferred it to DVD, I think there was something that they changed or lightened or removed a filter, because it's the day for night. It actually looks lighter even on the Blu-ray than it does on like the old prints of it that I've seen. So something happened. When I have Darren Gross on, and maybe Ansel again, I might ask them, because Darren Gross he's the one responsible for the Night of Dark Shadows restoration project and located all that footage. And he's also, he has also been looking for House of Dark Shadows footage, but that's believed to have been destroyed. According to Ansel Farage, it's probably gone, because there was stuff that was cut from House of Dark Shadows, like David hanging himself in the closet to scare Maggie and things like that was shot, but that's gone. And then
David is certainly a handful at the beginning of the story. Absolutely.
Oh yeah.
Yes.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, he's trying to scare Maggie. And then there was a scene that I don't think was ever shot, was Nancy Hodiak was going to be played by Marie Wallace, and some fans claim to have seen that, but that never existed. That was in the script, but they never did that scene.
My understanding is that there's a paperback book. I wonder if the paperback edition carries those scenes in there.
The paperback does have that stuff in it. And also this book, which for the video version of this podcast, you can see I'm holding it up, the Dark Shadows movie book, which was put out by Catherine Lee Scott, Pomegranate Press. And this contains the scripts for both House and Night of Dark Shadow, full script. So you can still, I mean, this is no longer, it's out of print, but you can find it on Amazon or eBay and things like that. But yeah, I mean, the movie, it kicks off right away. You got Willie freeing Barnabas from the coffin. He shows up at Collinwood, and it's great seeing all the actors. The first time I saw this, my uncle Valdemar, who introduced me to Dark Shadows, used
What
to
a
tell me,
great name, Valdemar.
Valdemar. He does kind of look like Paul Naschy too. He has
Interesting.
vaguely resembles him, but we call him Uncle Val for short, or
Okay.
TT Val. But he was a big monster kid too, so he's the one who got me into all of this stuff, and he introduced me to Dark Shadows and House of Dark Shadows. He used to tell me, oh, the movie version, Barnabas is really mean in the movie version. He kills everybody in the movie version.
He kind of does. I mean,
yeah,
he kind of does. Yeah.
yeah. And it's great seeing and I think that's probably one of the reasons why some fans really hate House of Dark Shadows, is that some fans love it and some fans hate. I love House of Dark Shadows. I just see it as kind of its own thing. It's its own universe.
The only line for me is the major motion picture that came out a few years ago that we're not going to really discuss.
Oh, yes.
that's kind of my
Agreed.
line. Everything
Agreed.
else with relation to Dark Shadows is pretty cool to me. Yeah.
Agreed. But Barnabas is really mean, but it was, I think one of the things people don't like is, you see these characters you get familiar with every day, like, Carolyn, for example, and Roger and Professor Stokes, and they all get murdered. I mean, they're all everybody, not Elizabeth and David. I think they're the only ones who make it to the end. Julia gets strangled. Everybody gets offed in House of Dark Shadows, for the most part.
Maybe that's why some fans don't like it, but I just felt like there was some great storytelling there. I think the whole Carolyn vampire story is really haunting and impressive, and it's quite the contrast to see the cops kind of gather to, I will say, finish her off. And it's quite an interesting contrast to the end of Night Stalker, where the cops are also kind of gathered around to sort of try to finish off the vampire. But I think there's some great storytelling. The pace in this film is relentless. It just goes 100 miles an hour, and then suddenly the movie's over, and you're left with this with all this information that you take in, and you're sitting there thinking that you're going to watch perhaps an extension of the story. Maybe that's why the trailers felt so, were so clear in stating, hey, this is the movie version. We're not sort of running in the parallel universe, right? So it's with the TV series, but it's still, I think, an incredible, piece of filmmaking. The introduction of Barnabas through his POV moving through, is, I think, amazing. And some of the shot setups that Curtis pulls off, like the introduction of Roger through, Barnabas's cane.
Yes.
You kind of rack focus. I think it's really, really well done. There's a high level of thought that went into that. I completely love the Willie's discovery of the coffin and trying to break in and get the jewels, and then the payoff is suddenly Barnabas has the jewels, and he's presenting him as well as if he brought them from England. It's really good, solid storytelling. And I appreciate storytelling that doesn't have to sort of lay it out for you as you go. If you don't know what that necklace is, and that was Willie's goal and his treasure hunt, and now it belongs to the Collins family again. I just think that's really impressive stuff.
Yeah, and Barnabas, of course, has his reason why he has it. Given to his ancestor.
And he's very Machiavellian throughout the story.
Yes.
He's very clear, and I would say very very predatory is a good word. He's really aggressive in the story, and if you're used to sort of sublime and restrained the version of the character, and then suddenly you see this version of Jonathan Frid sort of being very aggressive and saying, oh, I want this, I want that, I need this, I need to do that, oh, I can be cured, that's great. So that's all done really quickly, very impressively, and shot beautifully. I mean, I can't understate the photography in this picture. Just gorgeous.
Agreed. And they did so many things that they weren't able to do on the show, like the funeral scene, for example. with Jerry Lacey as the minister, which was fun too, seeing all these actors even that we knew from the show and in smaller roles showing up in cameos, like Humperdinck Estrado shows up as a doctor, etc. But the funeral scene in the rain was so moody.
I agree.
And eerie, and it just gives you just feel cold, chilly, like watching that, like you're gray and overcast. And then scenes later on, like in the monastery, beautiful Gothic scene with the candelabras everywhere, and
absolutely
the fog rolling down the stairs, and Catherine Lee Scott in this 18th century wedding dress, and Barnabas with his arms out. It's just incredible. Just sublime is the word there. I mean, it really is something that is, whether you like the content or not. I know Jonathan Frid himself was not a fan of House of Dark Shadows because he thought
sorry to hear that.
Yeah, he felt it was too. I used the word lurid earlier. He felt it was too much in that direct. It was too. He liked playing the subtlety more. He felt it wasn't. It was too overboard, he thought. But I mean, that was
I tell my kids and my students, it's okay to like both.
Exactly. That's
okay.
That's how I feel. I like both. I love House of Dark Shadows. If somebody were to say which is your favorite, I'm going to pick the TV show because it's more.
Well, there's just more. I mean, there's a 2-hour movie, and then there's just 1,500 episodes, right?
Sure.
Like, come on, it's an epic story.
And I'm just cutting in here with an additional thought that I thought of after the show ended, and I really should have mentioned it. I just want to point out a contrast here with the TV show. There's something inviting about the TV show that makes you want to live in that world, even though Collinwood is a dangerous place to live. Collinsport itself is a dangerous place to live. There's a good chance you're not going to make it, or you're going to come back as some undead ghoul, okay, if you live there. But there's something, I don't know, there's a warmth almost. There's something inviting, that fantasy, that escape, that sort of romanticism, that romantic dark fantasy element that pulls you in to that world, right? Whereas the House of Dark Shadows universe, I don't want to live there. I don't want to live in that Collinwood. I don't want to live in that Collinsport. There's a coldness to that version of Dark Shadows, but it's still really cool. It's great to watch. It's a great horror movie, It's like we were talking about Marvel Comics in this episode. It's like Marvel's What If. Okay, what if the ghost of Sarah Collins never appeared? Or what if Dan Curtis had gone through with his original plan for Barnabas Collins? It's an alternate version of the established events that doesn't affect the established events. It's just sort of a fun what if, and it's super fun. It's just a super fun exercise in let's try this version of the story, a different flavor of Dark Shadows with certain elements altered so that events go in a different direction. And I think that's fun. But there's something that's not as inviting, I would say, as the TV show. So just a thought I'm throwing out there. Yeah.
I will say that you don't see the exterior of the blue whale in this picture, but yet it's still shot at a really interesting location. The scene between David and Caroline in that sort of abandoned pool location is really cool, just really well done. And again, so much of our literature and imagery of vampirism is based on this sort of pale face floating ghost-like against the dark night. And that scene and a few others does that for me. Dr. Stokes' turn at the end of the picture is really shot in a very misty, very dark, location, and it's awesome. If anything, that scene goes too short because you get a sense of it, and then you're sort of terrified, and then he's gone, which is too bad because it's a really cool scene, and it makes me wonder what other stuff must have been cut, because my only lament with that picture is that it's an hour and a half long, and another 10 or 15 minutes wouldn't have hurt it, perhaps.
There were a few other things that didn't make it into the film, like there's this whole thing that Roger Davis's character Jeff Clark is an artist, and so there's one part in the film where Barnabas tells Willie, he says, Willie says, what are you going to do to him? He's concerned Barnabas is going to harm. And Barnabas says, I'm not going to do anything to him. In fact, I've done something for him. And that references, there was a scene that was going to be in the film that Roger Davis's character finds out that Barnabas has arranged an art show for him in Boston to get him out of town. So that was cut. And then there's another scene with Jeff Clark too, testing out the crossbow, the one he uses to shoot. There's a scene where he's supposed to test it out first. There was some stuff like that didn't make it into the final film. But the thing with Stokes, he was a very that was like I hadn't seen the trailer yet when I was a kid. If you watch the trailer, it'll spoil it. But I didn't know Stokes was going to get turned into a vampire because and I want to talk about some of the other characters in addition to Barnabas, but Stokes is one of them because Professor Stokes in the show was always kind of the Van Helsing of the show, in that he was sort of the occult scholar who's the one who's initially kind of suspicious of some things about Barnabas. But here he's all the way in Van Helsing mode. Like he finds out Barnabas is a vampire. And he's the one who stakes Carolyn, and then he starts to pursue Barnabas as well. But the twist that he actually fails and is turned into a vampire is that was shocking to me when I was a child when I saw that. And Carolyn,
it's shocking too. Because you don't expect it, of course, but the way that the story is paced at that point, it's rushing toward its conclusion, and so you're kind of with the movie as it kind of gears up toward the ending, and audiences really understand that stuff. They understand when they're excited, and unfortunately they understand when they're bored, and with this picture there really isn't a moment to do that. I feel like
the pacing is great. It's like a runaway train. It's just like boom, boom,
it really
boom.
is. It really is. And then you have this sort of momentum going toward the end, and you think that everyone's just kind of going to run in and help out, but no, actually Roger and Dr. Stokes have met an unfortunate fate. And that I really love in storytelling, when stuff happens off screen and then you're introduced to it as part of the exposition as in a surprise. So there's the double beat where Stokes is a vampire, but he's also failed in his mission, and he can't help out anymore because he's one of the undead now. And
so how about what some of the other characters I'll just throw out at you? Catherine Lee Scott as Maggie Evans when I had Catherine on this show, she pointed out that Leonard Maltin told her she was in more shots in the film than Jonathan Frid was. So she was in the film even more than Jonathan was. She was doing the TV show at the same time, so she came out like everybody else who was doing it, and so she played Maggie, the governess. What did you think of her?
I thought that her performance was impressive because she has to be kind of a convincing character on many levels. She has to be this governess, and she has to be this friend, and she also has to play the object of Barnabas' affections, and yet she still kind of stands her ground as a smart character. Like you really kind of get the sense that she's kind of one of the more inquisitive characters in the story, and there's a scene where she's walking around with Barnabas during daylight, and it's an extraordinary scene because we know that he's a vampire walking around during the day, but the way that she plays her dialogue with him during that scene, and you're supposed to understand that she's really impressed by him, and the way that she explains, we were having dinner the other night, and you were so focused on me, and today you seem sort of very distant. And then Jonathan sort of explains that this is kind of a whole new world for me to, and she thinks that perhaps he's referring to their relationship, but he's also referring to, of course, being out, in this new world that he hasn't seen in almost 200 years. And so I was just really impressed by the way that she just kind of gave a credence to her character that kind of goes a little bit further than the stuff I've seen in the series, if I may be so bold.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, they never did a scene like that, in the
Correct.
show where they're walking around in the daylight. I mean, Barnabas, I always felt that Julia's cure, it could never be permanent. And George DiCenzo, the associate producer,
it's a supernatural
it's
thing.
a supernatural
It's not a
affliction.
scientific thing.
Yeah, I think she
Yeah.
could arrest it temporarily. I mean, with mad science, you can maybe arrest it temporarily, but I think with a supernatural curse, you can't really eliminate it. And I think ultimately that would have been kind of doomed to failure. The only time when it really actually kind of did succeed was with the Adam experiment, which was a mad science experiment with the man-made monster Adam in the show. But I think in the film, though, it's interesting because in the TV show, Barnabas is the one who forces Julia to speed up the experiments because they're starting to work, and then it's his fault. And whereas in the film version, just like in the show, Julia is in love with Barnabas, but I think my friend Raymond Castile says Julia is the ultimate example of being friend zoned. She's always, in that Barnabas does not reciprocate her feelings in that way. But in the movie, she's the one who actually decides to undermine the experiment, and
she's gonna pack up and get out of here. She's like, I'm gonna give him the a double dose, and I am out of here. And that scene is actually pretty shocking, in my opinion.
That shocked the hell out of me when I was a child. I wasn't expecting Barnabas to happen and Julia to die. It was just like very shocking when I first saw that.
No, and I have to say, all of the attacks all the vampire attacks in this story are pretty shocking. They're violent.
You can even hear the crunch when he bites.
Yes, you can. Yes,
like,
you can.
Whoa.
And then the sort of the gaping, torn flesh of the neck is when Carolyn is attacked is quite shocking. Yeah. And poor Willie just kind of standing there. He's so shocked. Though John Carlin's reaction is, I think, incredible, and it makes that scene.
Nancy Barrett and John Carlin were so good. Fantastic.
Terrific. It's terrific, and just really the advantage that this picture had over the TV show, if the audience doesn't mind me saying so, is the actors knew their characters by this point.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh yeah.
So it's a little different than sort of growing into the character as you play it on a daily basis. And then suddenly a few years later, you're like, hey, we're going to revisit this characters in another story, but it's, it's the same character. And so the actors all really knew and played very, very well their parts. And, poor Dr. Hoffman is a very complicated character in that story. And she at times feels like it seems like she doesn't really is coming to the realization that she's in love with Barnabas, especially in that scene with where Elliot just plows in and confronts her. Again, we kind of keep going back and forth, but it's a terrific scene. Like, they're great actors, and he's like, I'm going to hold you responsible for this, and it's really great. But in my opinion, the best scene in the picture is with Dr. Hoffman is when she confronts Barnabas. She goes to his house.
Oh yeah.
And she takes out a cross, and she's like, "What do you think of this, fella?" And she's like, "I'll put it away if you guarantee my safety." It's like, it's great stuff. It's great.
It is, yeah.
And the way that Barnabas reacts to it,
put that away.
It's very cool. I really feel like the series and this TV show influenced pictures like the Frank Langella Dracula.
Yeah, I could see that. Yeah.
Salem's Lot, some of the late 70s stuff just was really influenced by some of the scenes we talked about here. And Barnabas just beats the heck out of Willie. And it's terrific in a horrific way. You believe it completely. And then when Stokes shows up, Willie's just kind of turny, it is really a journey of Willie and Barnabas throughout the story. And yet, the scenes the scene with Barnabas and Dr. Hoffman is really great. Her introduction to him, the way the mirror gag done in a different way. It's just really, really well shot. And then it culminates in, she gets she gets strangled by a livid Barnabas. Like, he just was not going to accept anything. He could not accept her betrayal. Like, that's kind of his deal. You're either in or you're out. And he murders her. Maggie walks in, starts screaming, and essentially Barnabas replenishes himself with her. It's terrific movie making, and that camera is like moving around, and it's quite the contrast to the TV show where you have like a coverage. Maybe you have 2 or 3 cameras in one scene, and I get that. But here, the camera's just whipping around. It's really impressive.
Yeah, it's a sort of a frenetic feeling, like, just like how, Barnabas is, what's happening to me. It's kind of gives you that feeling, an anxious feeling almost. And when then you see, of course, as you mentioned, the Dick Smith old man makeup for Barnabas, and he also did the bite, those gruesome bites that Dan Curtis wanted something even more gruesome looking than the 2 puncture wounds, the traditional 2 puncture wounds.
You could see like, there's a pancake flap. Forgive me, everybody. It looks like a pancake flap, just kind of hanging out there, and it's quite horrifying.
He accomplished that. I guess he took a piece of veal, Dick Smith, and bit into it a few times. Then he took a fork and made deeper holes in it, and then he made a mold of that, and that's what he used for the wound on the neck. And then the old man makeup, that is one of the most terrifying images, just nightmare fuel, to see, Elizabeth, poor Elizabeth. We haven't mentioned much about Joan Bennett, who is ostensibly is the star of the film, or along with Jonathan Frid, but she's not in the film a whole lot. She's gone catatonic when Carolyn dies, and then rises as a vampire and gets staked. So she's in this kind of catatonic state, kind of sitting, staring off, but she hears Maggie scream, walks into the room, and the first thing she sees is, this dead police officer, this hideous, monstrous old man with blood dripping down his face, and Maggie Evans dead on it. This is horror. This is pure.
It's pure horror.
Horror.
Absolutely. The whole daily TV show aspect of the show was gone at this point, and we're watching a Dan Curtis Hammer horror film.
Yes,
blood is even the blood is like this really saturated red, and
exactly
it's,
like Hammer. It looked like Hammer blood.
Absolutely. And there's a scene. The scene that's kind of haunting for me is when the cop that's guarding Maggie is asleep. By the way, the cop is the dad in Back to the. Is it
George DiCenzo?
Mom's dad.
George DiCenzo. Yeah, he was the associate producer of the TV show and the film, and he was getting into acting, and he became a very successful actor.
He absolutely became a successful actor. But anyway, the scene where he's sort of asleep, and the secret door just opens, and then this figure just kind of comes out. And
so eerie.
That makeup, it's so creepy. Creepy.
It really, and then him kind of just looming over Maggie, and she removes the crazy, just staring at her with those bloodshot eyes.
Just like the Langella Dracula. There's a scene where he comes to the bedroom of Mina, and it's the same. It feels the same for me here. It's just like this picture was really influential.
For sure. And just the whole idea of, which they did in the TV show and in the movie, and then as you pointed out in the Jack Palance Dracula, the idea of the look-alike of the vampires. They did it in the Mummy, in the 32 Mummy with the Mummy with Karloff, but as applied to a vampire, Dark Shadows was the first to do that, where the vampire's lost love is now in the present, looks exactly the same, and he becomes obsessed with her. That came right through the ages into current vampire pop culture.
If you watch the Jack Palance Dracula and then the Coppola Dracula, you'll see a lot of similarities. The Coppola Dracula is beautiful into itself, but there's, again, like that's why I say that Dan Curtis is just kind of this really important figure in the whole monster culture.
Sure.
movement of the 60s and 70s. Just a really, smart guy.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And big part of that too, in this film and in all of Curtis's output, Robert Cobert rescored all of his, a lot of his key themes from the show and stuff, but they're kind of amped up to, I think he had a bigger orchestra to play with, and it's more layered. The soundtrack for the film, the score that Cobert does is very eerie and really fits the mood perfectly for each of these scenes, for sure.
Whenever Curtis wants to show sort of intrigue, the soundtrack plays what I call the Dan Curtis flute, which is kind of this lilting, right?
Yes.
It's very endearing, in my opinion. They do it in The Night Stalker as well.
Oh yeah.
And this film has it as well, but it's just heightened. Yeah. Everything just kind of feels like we're telling you a more dramatic story on a lot of levels, and we're not afraid to go there. And this picture was not afraid to do that. And when Barnabas kidnaps Maggie and sets up the third act, all the cops come together. There's this great shot, French Connection like shot. This precedes the French Connection, in my opinion, where the camera's in the back of the car, the police car, where it's approaching the big house, and you just set off this incredible chain of events that leads us to the heightened third act.
The third act, which of course we have Sheriff Patterson, who in this version is played by Dennis Patrick, who was of course Jason Maguire and Paul Stoddard in the TV show.
I know, and one of the great, I have to say, Jason. It's one
Dennis
of the
Patrick.
Great villains.
Oh, for Jason Maguire,
Jason Maguire is one of the great villains of the show. And it was great to see him here as a protagonist, and everyone's just kind of gathering together. But instead of the Frankenstein torches, they're busting out the silver bullets.
And stakes. And I've had friends, a couple of friends who watched the movie, like, why silver bullets? It's for werewolves, not vampires. There are actually, it's not as common. Usually it's the wooden stake, but there are instances.
That's correct.
Montague Summers' books where he talks about vampire lore. There are instances where the silver bullet is mentioned.
Works as well.
Yeah, and then the hammer, the satanic rites of Dracula later on, we see that as figure into it. I mean, occasionally, it's one of the lesser things you see with relation to vampires. It's more associated with werewolves.
Well, Dr. Stokes gets filled with silver. Right? Like he gets dispatched that way. So
yes,
but Barnabas is the master vampire, and so it takes a little bit more than that to get rid of him.
Absolutely, yeah. Which is okay. So we're here in the third act. Barnabas has taken Maggie to St. Eustace Island, to this abandoned monastery.
Great idea for a setting. Great idea.
Perfect Gothic, isolated,
absolutely
creepy setting. I mean, it's Gothic. So going off to this island, Willie is preparing Maggie, and you mentioned Willie's sort of arc throughout the film. Barnabas and Willie kind of redeems himself at the end. He really
absolutely
does, because he helped. Jeff Clark shows up, as you say, battles Stokes, and Stokes is very powerful, throws him off the cliff and down the hill rather, and then Jeff kills him with the silver bullets. And Thayer David was very uncomfortable with getting into the water like that. He did it, but it was he was a little scared about doing that. He was not a fan of going into the water, but he did do it. And then we have Roger Collins get staked, which was very shocking for fans of the TV show.
Was very shocking, and very the sort of the graphic buildup of the violence, right? The shooting with the silver bullets. You kind of have the staking of Roger, and then the conclusion of the picture. But poor Roger was kind of a surprise. You don't, if you haven't seen the trailer, you're surprised that this is all going this way. And it's also kind of meant to feel, in my opinion, to make the audience feel like Barnabas is this formidable character. Like a few vampire hunters have tried to kill him, and off screen he has shown his worth, and you're not going to get rid of him that easy.
Absolutely. And I'm sure it was fun for the actors from the show, because everybody always talks about like, I wanted to play a vampire. Nancy Barrett always says, I was a great vampire. And she was the kind of the Lucy Westerna of House of Dark Shadows. She was a sensational vampire, but everybody kind of, a lot of them got kind of a shot at doing the vampire thing. But anyway, so Jeff finds this old crossbow. He tries to get Maggie out of there, and Willie, under the vampire's thrall against his will, bashes Jeff over the head because Willie can't resist.
That's a terrific shot, by the way. It's done as a mirror gag, like you see it. You see it as a reflection in the mirror, and again, just more great camera work by Curtis and the crew.
Yeah. And then there are these beautiful shots of Willie leading Maggie down the staircase, and these sort of transposed images of the close up and the long shot, and it's beautifully shot. It is
beautifully shot.
Yeah.
And that just juxtaposition of sort of medium shots and close-ups and wides throughout that sequence is just really effective and haunting, and you just really understand the tension and the stakes of the situation.
Yeah. Was that an intentional pun with the stakes there?
Yeah. No. Here we are.
Yes, but
there's too much I'm sorry. I usually have more foray in me in the morning than I do right now. But
see, it's in your soul. It just came right out,
absolutely.
even without thinking about it. I love it.
Absolutely.
And of course, just side note, House of Dark Shadows was, of course, made the cover of Famous Monsters of Filmland. Dark Shadows made the cover of classic Famous Monsters of Filmland 4 times, 2 times for the TV show with one of beautiful Basil Gogo's covers, which I remember when I was a kid. My uncle gave me that. Yeah. Oh, beautiful. And then House and Night of Dark Shadows both got covers for Famous Monsters.
When you opened up the ads for Famous Monsters, they used to have these posters that you could get. One of them was for Barnabas Collins.
I have it. The giant. I have it. It's in the other room. The Warren poster.
And that's how big of a part Dark Shadows, how big of an impression Dark Shadows had made upon the monster culture.
For sure. I mean, Fari Ackerman was a huge fan of the show, and so was Fritz Lang. After I recorded with Don, he told the story about how Fritz Lang would go to the Acker Mansion. And I've heard this story before. Would go to the Acker Mansion to watch he'd watch it there and lock himself, and did not want anybody to bother him while he was watching really Dark Shadows. And he'd went to the studio a couple of times, because of course he'd worked with Joan Bennett, famously, in the golden age of Hollywood. He did films with
Joan Bennett is not in the picture very long, but she lends a lot of old Hollywood golden era celebrity cred to not just to the series, but to this picture as well. Just for sure, classy,
big time, yeah. So we, Jeff, Barnabas is gonna, turn Maggie into a vampire. Jeff shows up, and Willie. And when I first saw this when I was a kid, I thought that Willie was trying to, because he was in Barnabas' thrall, I thought he was trying to protect Barnabas against his will, like if anybody tries to harm Barnabas.
He was doing
he's the Renfield, he's trying to protect Barnabas, but I think he actually is trying to pull Barnabas off Maggie Evans. As I've watched it over the years, I'm like, because I don't think he can see Jeff from where he is.
He's not doing that. Those are 2 different things.
He's trying to pull Barnabas off of Maggie, correct, which in an act of final, asserts his own will and tries to pull. But of course, bad timing, ultimate bad timing. The crossbow bolt hits Willie instead of Barnabas, and Barnabas throws Willie off in this great kind of slow motion scene and looks up and sees Jeff Clark. And I know some people don't like this scene because they think it's too overboard, but I love it when Barnabas points to Jeff, goes Clark, and you hear that
Dracula
echo.
Stuff. How can you not like that?
It's awesome. God. I love it. I know the echo can be kind of hard to understand what
that was the filmmaking at that point, though. That was to use echoes to sort of accentuate rather than overstate
and indicate that he's putting him in his power.
This is
he's a vampire. He can, he's a vampire. Yeah,
yes, absolutely.
I love that. It's great.
Me too. It's very cool, and it sets up, in my opinion, the most significant moment of the picture. And Willie, in an unhealthy way, has sort of always in the story proclaimed his love for Maggie Evans, and essentially he saves her life at this point.
He does. Because Jeff drops the crossbow. He's in
He
Barnabas's
drops
power.
the crossbow ball, if you will.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, he does.
He
But
does.
Willie picks it up, and from behind, as Barnabas is about to complete the bite, he drives the crossbow bolt through Barnabas's chest and then falls to the ground. That was his last act of heroin. And then Jeff Clark finishes the job.
Finishes the deal.
Really, I mean, I think my friend... Yeah.
It's pretty graphic.
It is. My friend Ricardo, and he was like, that's one of the most legit stakings I've ever seen.
I must agree. I mean, that's, I've seen quite a few of them, and they actually go the other way around, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
But this one is quite graphic and quite believable. I don't know if Dick Smith was involved in that, but holy smokes, you buy that completely.
It was gruesome and really
gruesome is
violent and intense. And I know Roger Davis tells the story that Jonathan Frid was pretty ticked off at him because I guess Dan Curtis took Roger Davis aside privately and said, when you stake him, really like lift him off the ground, try to lift. And he did. Roger Davis really rammed it into him. And Frid, I think he hurt his back. He had hurt his back on the show in like 1968 during one of the scenes with Adam. So I think he had a bad back, and he was pretty ticked off, which I understand. Like Dan Curtis should have told Jonathan, like he should have had everybody together on the same page, like how this is going to work, kind of thing.
Communication is a healthy thing.
Yes, but it looked great. I mean,
it looks great.
The end result is
it looks just great. Like if you watch the making of The Exorcist, Bill Friedkin wasn't exactly forthcoming with the entire cast in terms of sometimes their reactions and the sound effects, the sounds that he would use on sets to get the reaction.
Mm-hmm.
But it really works here. It's completely gruesome, as you say, and just kind of the stuff you hadn't really seen before. The saturation of the blood as well. It's just it's just that's kind of the fatal blow.
Yeah.
Well, or what we think is a fatal blow.
And that level of, to me, that level of like that Hammer level or House of Dark Shadows level of gore is about my limit. Like, I don't think it's extreme. Like some of these horror movies in the last, I don't know, I never got into like extreme gore film. That turns me off. I have no interest in that.
I'm not a big Texas Chainsaw Massacre guy. Like that's, even like I'm all about the supernatural
same here
stuff. I mean, even like I just posted about the Night of the Living Dead remake. That's even a little further than I would go. I remember being quite horrified at the climax of the original Night of the Living Dead, and that's pretty with the little girl. And, yeah. But I'm more of a supernatural horror kind of guy. I'm not really big on the slasher stuff. I mean, there's
me too.
films that are really well made, and the Psychos,
that's
Hitchcock
great.
Psycho.
That's amazing.
A class unto itself, and I understand that. But I'm more of a vampire and werewolf guy. Let's put it that way.
Right. Yeah. Agreed. I think. I mean, on the other hand, you see people like, you shouldn't have any of that, and it's like, well, you're dealing with monsters, you're dealing with the undead, so there has to be some of that. It is part of what terror and horror kind of. It's there's a balancing act, but at some point
there's a reason. I mean, Texas Chainsaw Massacre was based on actual events, and that's cool, but not my bag.
I can't watch that. And it's funny, I was having a conversation about this with my friend Rebecca, who is a huge Texas Chainsaw Massacre fan. And it's not super gory. It's just
it's well made. I can't argue with the filmmaking.
Said the same thing.
That's a terrific picture on that level. Certainly, he went on and made Salem's Lot and Poltergeist, which are really two really great films in the genre, but I prefer those two films too.
Yeah, same. I mean, my thing is, it's just, to me, I agree with you. I told her the same thing. I said, I can see why this has a cult following and why it's a very famous film, but to me, it's just depressing. It's like you said, it's based on real life events, but it's also, this could happen. And in fact, is based on things that happened, feeling to it that just, it doesn't heighten my senses in a way that something like House of Dark Shadows or the TV show does, or any kind of classic horror where it's like what's hidden in the shadows. Yes, you're going to see that splash of blood, but it's really more that supernatural aura that surrounds it versus
Correct.
this is just kind of makes me feel sad when I watch it and down. I don't want to feel that way when I watch a movie. I want to feel like good about it. Like this was a fun carnival ride kind of feeling.
There's like a love there that I had for the Universal monster films. There's a love there that I had for Ray Bradbury's, works, and there's a charm to Halloween that's kind of based on a childhood love of things that are interesting and different, and that's what monsters are, and I really enjoy that, and I feel like a lot of the horror stuff, the slasher stuff, I guess is what I'll label it, is it just seems too on the money.
Totally. Now, last thing for this film, of course, so Jeff takes Maggie away. He has saved the day, or Willie, and so we see that this creepy end credit scene where the Barnabas is lying. It's
awesome.
There. It's so good with the fog, the mist just slowly enshrouds him, and you hear the music playing, and the credits just start rolling like this is the end of the film. Now, nowadays we're so used to things like the Marvel movies and stuff having these post-credit scenes. Correct. This is an early example of a post-credit scene, and I feel bad for those who just walked out of the theater when this was playing, because it wasn't the first post-credit scene. There was one, I think it was a 1966 movie with Dean Martin, but I can't remember the title of the film, but I believe that was the first kind of official in cinema post-credit scene. I believe, I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure it is. But House of Dark Shadows was only 4 years later. And as the credits come to an end, the music builds to one of the, when I had Ben Alba on here, it was like sort of the ultimate horror sting on the Dark Shadows TV show, which dun 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 dun. And it did that, and all of a sudden you see Barnabas's body disappear and transform into a bat and fly off. And it's like, well, Barnabas survived. Maybe my thing when I first watched this when I was a kid was like, the stake must have missed his heart, and maybe it just like grazed his heart, or like maybe it didn't fully penetrate his heart and went like on the side of his heart. Like I was trying to figure out like how did he survive that mega staking that he just happened. So it must have like grazed his heart maybe and missed it. I don't know. What's your theory on that?
My theory on that is that it must have just missed the main valve, if you will. And also I saw it as like, hey, we're pretty confident that we're going to make more of these, and we're setting up a sequel. Yes. And I guess you could look at it that the sequel was to keep watching the TV show, but it would have been great to see a couple of more films with Mr. Fridd as the vampire of Collinsport.
That was the plan.
I'm sorry that didn't happen. Perhaps it was like, I don't know if it contractually, Mr. Fridd had only signed for one picture. Kind of like George Lazenby with the James Bond films, where they made the mistake of only signing him for one film, which, come on, if you sign somebody. Now that's standard practice, right? You sign for the main picture and any subsequent sequels, but it would have been cool to see more of these, honestly.
Yeah. And it's exactly what happened was that the plan was, the House of Dark Shadows was a big hit for MGM. It did very well. It was a big hit. And Dan Curtis became, addicted to making film. Like he wanted to make movies now. So they already started working on a sequel in 1970. They were working on the sequel. Sam Hall wrote the script. Did they write a script? Or it might have just been a treatment for the film. I know there was some preliminary work that was done on it. I don't know if he wrote a full script or an initial draft. Ansel Farage or Darren Gross would probably have more specific information about that. But regardless, that whatever Sam wrote no longer exists. Nobody has seen it, as far as I'm aware. And it was going to feature Barnabas Collins in a sequel. And from what I understand, the little I've heard, I think Ansel Farage posted something about it, that the little that they know, they believe it was going to be a flashback to the past. Like, I don't know
Ooh,
and probably I assume it was going to be the curse, like Angelique putting the curse. I'm
right.
guessing it was going to be something like that. I don't know, but that nobody know. They asked Sam. People have asked Sam Hall had asked him over the years, and he couldn't even remember. They were going to make the sequel with Frid. It was originally titled Curse of Dark Shadows, and then Jonathan Frid was not happy with House of Dark Shadows. In fact, during the while it was while he was promoting it, he actually kind of made some comments that were not positive about the film.
Oh,
He didn't care
okay.
for the tone of it. Like I said, Jonathan Frid was a really classy guy. You know, he
Very
liked,
genteel, it seems.
yeah, he liked the subtlety of how he was doing it on the TV show. So anyway, he decided he didn't want to be typecast as a vampire, and he ultimately said, I don't want to do the sequel.
I mean, that's too bad. I think Mr. Curtis, I
Mm.
wish that they could have gone to Jonathan and say, well, maybe we can make this story a little bit more, to your liking.
I agree. If they could have sat down, I think maybe if they had sat
Let's
down
figure
with
it
him and
out.
said, let's collaborate, let's make
Yeah.
this work. Because, I mean, let's face it, people want to see Barnabas Collins. You know, they want to see the vampire, or, he was sort of
He's the show, if you will.
He's the huge draw. And I love Quentin and Angelique too, but it's kind of like you almost kind of need to have the Barnabas component too. But
Right.
anyway, Dan Curtis was furious that Jonathan didn't want to do the sequel.
So okay,
yeah,
it really does parallel the Lazenby James Bond
Mm.
producer thing, where everyone got kind of mad at each other and just split up. That's too bad.
Yeah, and it was close to the end of this year. So anyway, it was near the end of the series, I think, around December 1970, and then the series ended like 3 months later, April 1971, 4 months later. But anyway, they had to rewrite the script and did Night of Dark Shadows instead, which focused on Quentin and Kate Jackson's character Tracy. She's called Tracy in the film, and Angelique. So it was a totally different story, which got butchered by MGM. Wanted Curtis to edit the film down. The original Night of Dark Shadows was significantly longer. I think 45 minutes longer of Night of Dark Shadows.
Really?
Oh, yeah. It was a much longer film with a lot of key scenes that were chopped out of the film because MGM wanted the movie to be an hour and a half long. And they told Curtis, if you don't cut these scenes out, we will do it. And so last minute, it was sadly, it was kind of a hack job. They had to really, literally hack out segments of the film that were key to the plot.
That's never a good situation where the filmmaker makes a film that's this long and suddenly the studio's like, that's, again, communication is a good thing. And, when stuff like that has happened, it's when, there just isn't good communication between the filmmakers and the studio, and that's really too bad, because that ideally, you could have had a parallel situation where the TV show kind of continues, and yet you still have these movies being made, and it would have been terrific to have explored sort of earlier timelines, perhaps more genteel Jonathan Frid friendly stories that could have I don't know, it would have been nice to get Frid and everybody in a room together and hash this out, because
for
this
sure
is terrific stuff.
I agree.
Stuff.
Agreed. And I still, I'm gonna, when I have Darren Gross on, hopefully he will agree to do the show. I'd love to chat with him. I want to talk about all those things that he has found. That he found all of the missing scenes from Night of Dark Shadows and has restored the film with help from people like Ansel Farage. He got re-recorded actors' voices, parts of the audio were missing.
Oh, wow.
I'd love to see the full Night of Dark Shadows.
Of course.
For sure. But I still love Night of Dark Shadows too. But anyway, great discussion on this film here, Ricardo. Any closing thoughts on House of Dark Shadows, or just Dark Shadows, or monster culture in general?
Yeah, I think that within the whole lexicon of Dark Shadows, that House of Dark Shadows has, in my opinion, this significant niche that went explored, and unfortunately was not explored any further. And I understand that there are those that may not look fondly at this, but at this picture, but I really enjoyed it. I continue to enjoy the series. I most certainly feel like it's a significant story that has a great pedigree, and I encourage those of you out there that have not seen this picture to watch it, with an open mind. Like it's okay to like both, and you should enjoy it for what it is. Kind of like Derek interviewed me about the Spanish language version of the 31 Dracula, and there are those that like one or the other, and I don't feel that way. I enjoy both of those films, and I enjoy both this picture and the series, and I encourage everyone out there to look at this stuff with an open mind and just enjoy. Like, this is like an added extra. This is like a 2-hour Blu-ray extra that you could sit there and watch and just take in. A lot of fun.
Yeah, I agreed. Look at it as just a parallel dimension where events unfolded in a different way. This is not doesn't affect the events of the TV show. It's
right. I get it if you're a fan of the TV show and you rolled in expecting to see, okay, well, I haven't seen the trailers, but I'm a Dark Shadows fan. Let's see what's going on. You might be shocked at some of the events that happen here. I get that, but let's say it's been 50 years, and so we can sort of look at it in a broader light and just enjoy it. There's really cool stuff in this.
It's cool.
This film. Yes,
it is
really
cool.
enjoyable. Really enjoyable.
And just to remind everyone, speaking of enjoyable and worth checking out, on Dracula of Transylvania, which in the video version I am holding up on camera. If you go to YouTube, you can watch the video version of this episode, and the upcoming Art of Dracula of Transylvania, for which I will put a Kickstarter link in the show notes when this episode is posted. Ricardo, thank you again for taking the time out of your very busy schedule. I know you're a super busy guy, but I appreciate you taking the time to talk with me today about Sombras Tenebrosas, or Casa de Sombras Tenebrosas.
There you go, Casa de Sombras Tenebrosas.
Yeah.
And, it was my pleasure. Glad to do it. Always happy to talk vampires and Children of the Night. It's part of my living, and it's a joy. It was a joy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Folks, please be sure. Thank you so much. And thank you for listening. Please be sure to subscribe to the podcast to keep up with the latest episodes. There are a lot of fun stuff coming up in the coming months. A lot of great guests too lined up. So be sure to subscribe. Please do like the podcast, rate and review the podcast. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, that is a great place to go and rate and review the podcast. Or if you're watching on YouTube, please subscribe to the channel and like the video. That does help the podcast to grow, but moreover, it helps the podcast to reach more fans. Share if you know fans of Dark Shadows or classic horror, classic monster movies, let them know about the podcast, because part of this is kind of just galvanizing the fans to kind of keep Dark Shadows alive, or undead, if you will, in the cultural zeitgeist. So I hope that we'll continue to do that.
And for as long as they lived, the Dark Shadows never truly vanished, for there will always be terror at Collinwood. Terror at Collinwood is a Penny Dreadful production.